Nobody expected Emma Raducanu to walk into one of the most heated debates in tennis and plant her flag on the opposite side from Carlos Alcaraz. It felt too direct, public, and blunt. Very unexpected, but that's exactly what happened. And the reason it still matters in 2026, and why the moment deserves more than the few days of Reddit arguments it generated when it happened, is because it reveals something true and important about both of these people that gets buried under the Raducaraz shipping content and the mixed doubles speculation and the exhibition match buzz. They are, at their cores, two fundamentally different kinds of professional athlete, and when it came to one of the most pressing conversations in their sport, they stood on opposite ends of the room and said so. Let's set the scene properly, because the context is everything, and the context by late 2025 had become genuinely alarming. The 2025 tennis season had been building toward a breaking point for months. It was not one incident, not one tournament, not one player's injury that brought things to a head. It was an accumulation. The North American hardcourt swing in August was brutal. Cincinnati in particular became a flashpoint in a way that nobody who was there has forgotten. Temperatures topped 35 degrees Celsius with humidity pushing 70%. Arthur Rinderknecht collapsed on court. Frances Tiafoe retired with heat-aggravated issues mid-match. And the whole world watched and started asking out loud whether the ATP had the basic duty of care infrastructure to protect the people playing its sport. Then came the Asian swing in October, and the situation deteriorated further. Shanghai became something close to a public scandal. Players were competing in sauna-like conditions, humidity above 80%, temperatures at 34 degrees, and the results were visible in the worst possible way. Djokovic vomited during a match. Sinner limped through another before eventually retiring. Alcaraz sustained an ankle injury in Tokyo. 5 players retired from their matches in Beijing on a single Monday. Daniil Medvedev was photographed barely able to move on court before he finally called it quits, trailing badly in a deciding set. This was the backdrop, an entire autumn of the world's best tennis players being broken down, publicly, in real time, by a combination of heat, humidity, and a schedule that simply did not stop. It was in this environment that Alcaraz, Sinner, Swiatek, Gauff, Zverev, Draper, and several others had had enough, and said so. Alcaraz was direct about it, stating plainly that something had to be done with the schedule, that it was too tight, that the bodies piling up were the evidence, and that the sport needed to take the welfare of its players seriously rather than treating their complaints as an inconvenience. He had sustained an ankle injury at the Tokyo Open that required heavy strapping and put his participation in doubt for days, and then pulled out of Shanghai entirely to rest and recover, a decision that in isolation looked responsible, but which carried its own complications given his exhibition schedule earlier in the year. Swiatek went further than Alcaraz, floating the idea of skipping mandatory tournaments to protect her health, a statement that carried the weight of a genuine warning shot, because Swiatek skipping a mandatory event carries enormous financial and ranking implications. And the fact that she was willing to put that possibility on the table publicly told you everything about how exhausted and fed up she was. Gauff talked about sustainability. Zverev and Draper both voiced similar concerns. The calendar, particularly the Asian swing in October, and the stretch of mandatory Masters 1000 events that had been extended in recent years to feel more like Grand Slam fortnights than regular tournaments, was being described as unsustainable by virtually every player who had an opinion. Djokovic, who had been making the same argument for more than 15 years, and who had founded an entire player association, the PTPA, specifically to pursue structural reform, agreed with the substance of the complaints, while directing some of his sharpest criticism not at the tour, but at his fellow players. He made the point publicly that players were not united enough, that they had not invested enough time or energy into using the structures available to them to force real change, and that the pattern of complaining loudly in October and then disappearing until the next October was precisely why nothing had changed in over a decade. The complaint chorus was loud. The follow-through historically had been almost non-existent. The conversation was everywhere. It was the defining story of the end of the 2025 season. And then Raducanu opened her mouth. She was at the BBC Sports Personality of the Year coverage, a high-profile, highly public platform, and she was asked about the scheduling debate that had consumed the sport. What she said was not gentle. She suggested that tennis players were in an extraordinarily privileged position compared to ordinary working people, and that presenting themselves publicly as burdened by their schedule was the wrong image to project to the sports audience. She talked about the disconnect between how tennis looks from the outside, a glamorous, well-compensated profession involving world travel and enormous prize money, and how the players were choosing to describe it. She pointed out that top players earn a very good living, which she considered should be part of the conversation rather than quietly set aside. And then she made an argument about optics and inspiration, suggesting that watching the sport's biggest names publicly complaining about their workload was not likely to inspire young people who were considering picking up a racket for the first time. The reaction was immediate and almost uniformly negative on social media. Reddit tore into her. Fans argued that she only played around 5 tournaments a year due to injury, which made her perspective on the demands of the full tour largely disconnected from the reality facing players who competed every single week. Others pointed out that her income profile was not representative of most professional tennis players. The vast majority of prize money, and in particular, the enormously lucrative off-court sponsorship deals that Raducanu has accumulated, flowed disproportionately to a tiny number of players at the very top of the sport. Meaning her framing of, "we earn a very good living," applied to almost nobody outside the top 50. Some went further, suggesting that her relatively light match load in 2025, a consequence of injury rather than choice, to be fair, meant she was speaking from a position that lacked the lived experience of grinding through 50-plus matches a season while managing a body that was being asked for more than it could safely give. All of that criticism had validity. Some of it was delivered with considerably less grace than the subject deserved. But here is what most of the commentary at the time missed, and what makes this episode more interesting in hindsight than it appeared in the moment. Raducanu was not wrong about everything. She was wrong about some things, and she made her case in a way that left her unnecessarily exposed. But the core of her argument contains a thread of truth that the people attacking her most loudly were choosing not to engage with. The optics problem is real. Professional tennis players, men and women who are compensated at a level that puts them in the global top fraction of a percent of earners, who travel the world in business class, who stay in the best hotels, who receive medical care that most people could not afford. Complaining publicly about their working conditions is a genuine PR problem for the sport. It does not mean the complaints are wrong. Alcaraz's ankle, Sinner's cramping body, Medvedev barely able to walk across a court in Shanghai. These are real things happening to real human beings, and the scheduling pressures that contributed to them are a legitimate structural issue that the sport needs to address. But the packaging of that argument matters. The way it lands with the public matters. And Raducanu's instinct, even if her execution was clumsy, was that the packaging had been poor. The comparison to Carlos Alcaraz specifically is the part worth sitting with longest, because in 2025, Alcaraz was simultaneously one of the loudest voices calling for schedule reform and one of the most active players in tennis when it came to exhibition matches and off-tour commitments. This contradiction was not lost on critics, including Djokovic himself, who suggested that the players most vocal about the schedule were not always the most disciplined about protecting their own time. Alcaraz pulled out of Shanghai, citing the need to rest and recover after playing exhibitions and committing to additional events that had added to his load. The argument that the schedule was too demanding was true. The argument that individual players had no agency in managing their own calendars was more complicated, and the fact that Alcaraz chose to play lucrative exhibition events while simultaneously calling for fewer mandatory tournaments created a tension that his critics were happy to highlight. Jim Courier, the former world number one, pushed back on the general complaints by noting that the actual number of weeks where players at the top level were required to compete was not dramatically different from previous eras. The off-season had shortened, yes, and certain events had expanded, but the players also had more control over scheduling than the narrative sometimes suggested. None of this is simple. The scheduling debate in professional tennis is genuinely complex, involving the competing interests of players, tournaments, broadcasters, governing bodies, and the ATP and WTA themselves. The PTPA, Djokovic's Player Association, has been pushing for structural reform for years and has made limited progress, partly because the top players whose collective action could force change have not been sufficiently united to apply real pressure. Marcos Baghdatis, the former world number 8, made this point with some force after the late 2025 round of complaints, arguing that the players who were loudest in the media about the schedule were precisely the players who had the power to change it through the PTPA if they chose to engage seriously rather than simply venting at press conferences and moving on. What Raducanu's intervention did, whatever you think of its merits, was force a different kind of conversation about the debate. Instead of everyone nodding along in agreement that the schedule was too demanding and the players deserved more rest, her comments created friction. They introduced a perspective, imperfectly expressed perhaps, but genuinely held, that the way the sport's biggest stars were choosing to discuss their grievances was not serving the sport well, and that the privilege framing deserved to be acknowledged even if it did not invalidate the underlying complaints. That is not a bad thing. Sports debates that become echo chambers, where everyone agrees and the conversation only moves in one direction, rarely produce the structural change they are ostensibly about. There is also something worth acknowledging about where Raducanu was personally at the moment she made these comments, because that context reframes everything about how she arrived at this position. By late 2025, she had spent 3 years fighting her own body. Multiple surgeries, both writs, her ankle, a string of problems that would have ended the careers of less stubborn people, and that certainly ended the media's belief in her comeback before she did. A ranking collapse from inside the top 10 to outside the top 300. A period where the British tennis press, which had built her up with the kind of hyperbole reserved for once-in-a-generation talents after the 2021 US Open, had quietly shifted to a different kind of coverage. One that asked, with increasing frequency, whether the story was over, whether the body was too fragile, whether the tennis was too inconsistent, whether the fairy tale was the whole story and there was nothing else coming. And she had done it. Quietly, determinedly, without the public hand-wringing that would have been entirely understandable given the scale of the setbacks. She had found coaches, multiple coaches, a parade of collaborations that critics used as evidence of instability, but which she experienced as a methodical search for what worked. And she had rebuilt. She was inside the world's top 30 by the end of 2025. She had reached the semi-final of the Miami Open. She had beaten top 10 players. She had shown through action rather than words that professional tennis at the elite level could be navigated even when your body was giving you almost nothing to work with. The instinct not to complain publicly about the difficulty of her situation had been a defining feature of how she had conducted herself through those years. There had been opportunities. Plenty of press conferences where she could have described the specifics of what she was going through. The surgeries, the rehabilitation, the grinding uncertainty of not knowing whether any given comeback would hold, and generated enormous public sympathy. She rarely took them. She kept the worst of it private and showed up to talk about her next match. Seen in that light, Her resistance to the scheduling complaint culture was not a display of ignorance about what the tour demands. It was a reflection of her own lived experience. Someone who had lost 3 years to injury and used that time not to complain, but to rebuild. Who looked at players with healthy bodies competing regularly and found the argument for sympathy harder to access than they expected. That does not make her right, but it makes her position understandable in a way that none of the Reddit pile-on managed to account for. And it makes the dismissiveness of the reaction, the framing of, "You only play 5 tournaments a year, so you don't get to have this opinion," look exactly as cheap as it was. Raducanu's playing record in 2025 was limited by injury, not by choice. The implication that her perspective was therefore invalid was both unfair and intellectually lazy. A perspective on the scheduling debate from someone who has spent 3 years being unable to play, who knows better than most what it looks and feels like to want to compete and be physically prevented from doing so, is arguably more interesting, not less, than the perspective of someone who has never missed a significant stretch of tennis in their career. What the whole episode ultimately revealed, more than anything else, is the gap between two very different philosophies of public communication in professional tennis, and two very different understandings of what an athlete owes their sport's public image. Alcaraz wears his feelings on his sleeve. He always has. He is a naturally expressive, emotionally transparent person who says what he thinks in real time without filtering it through a PR framework. When something bothers him, an umpire call, a scheduling issue, a physical limitation, he says so immediately, visibly, with the kind of unguarded honesty that makes watching him in press conferences almost as entertaining as watching him on a tennis court. That authenticity is one of the things that makes him so compelling and so beloved. Fans trust him because he seems incapable of giving the rehearsed answer. You believe what he says because there is no visible distance between what he thinks and what he says. But it also means that his public statements on structural issues are not always strategically coherent. The contradiction between his complaints about the schedule and his willingness to play exhibition events for large appearance fees was a genuine tension, and not an unfair one for critics to point out. You cannot simultaneously argue that you are being asked to play too much tennis and accept large checks to play additional tennis on your days off. Or rather, you can. Professional athletes are entitled to maximize their earnings, but you should expect that contradiction to be noticed and questioned. Raducanu, by contrast, is someone who has learned the cost of unguarded public communication at significant personal expense. She has been burned by interviews that went in unexpected directions. She has experienced the particular cruelty of British tabloid coverage, the way it builds you up with the same fervor it will later use to tear you down, the way a single press conference sentence becomes a headline that follows you for months. She has had her coaching decisions analyzed, her personal life speculated about, her injuries questioned, her commitment doubted. All of it in public, all of it relentless for the better part of 4 years. The result is a communication style that is managed, careful, considered. She thinks about what she is saying and why, and she arrives at her positions through a process that is more deliberate than the one Alcaraz uses. Sometimes that makes her come across as guarded, slightly removed, too controlled. And occasionally, as with the scheduling comments, it results in a take that lands badly, not because the thinking is wrong, but because the framing is disconnected enough from where most people are, that it reads as tone-deaf rather than principled. Neither approach is entirely right. The tennis world probably benefits from having both. The scheduling debate in professional tennis is not over. The ATP implemented new weather protocols for 2026, following the disasters of Cincinnati and Shanghai. Mandatory safeguards around extreme heat conditions that applied across the tour from January 2026. It was a meaningful step and a direct consequence of the public pressure that the complaints of 2025 had generated. The sport moved, not as far as the players wanted, and not on the calendar length question that most of the complaints were actually about, but it moved. Which means the complaint chorus of 2025 was not entirely for nothing, whatever Raducanu thought of its tone. The broader conversation about mandatory events, about the length of the Asian swing, about the physical cost of a season that starts in late December and does not properly end until late November. This will dominate the tennis conversation throughout 2026 and probably well beyond it. Alcaraz will say something about it again in the same unguarded way, probably at a press conference in October after a run of difficult matches. So will Sinner and Swiatek and Goff, each of them carrying the weight of a schedule that asks too much and gives back too little. Djokovic will continue pushing through the PTPA for the structural changes that 15 years of complaint culture have not produced. And Raducanu, who is now healthy, who is competing and winning again, who has spent the better part of a year wanting to play more matches rather than fewer, may find that her perspective has shifted by the time the subject comes around again. A player fighting for fitness sees the calendar differently from a player fighting to stay on the court. She has been both. She knows the difference better than almost anyone. But the moment she created in late 2025 by publicly disagreeing with Alcaraz and the rest of the complaint chorus will not be forgotten quickly. Not because it was the loudest moment in the debate, not because it produced the most insight, but because it was unexpected. Because it came from someone who had every reason to stay quiet, who could have nodded along with the consensus and avoided the backlash entirely, and instead said something she believed, even knowing it would cost her. And in a sports landscape where the safest answer is almost always the one that agrees with the popular view, there is something worth respecting about a player willing to say the unpopular thing in public and stand behind it. Even if on balance, she probably should have said it differently. And there you have it. If you watched until the end, thank you for the support. This is the kind of conversation this channel is built for. Here is the question I want you to answer. Who do you think was right in this debate? Alcaraz and the players calling for schedule reform? Or Raducanu saying it's a privileged position they should be careful about complaining from? Drop your take below. I genuinely want to read both sides on this one.